I've seen this movie before at the dawn of the consumer internet. Different technology, same story. And I think it's a story worth telling before we spend a bunch of time talking about AI.
This is Winning at Work, a podcast about how to think better, make better decisions, and build a career that actually works.
I remember a time before the internet. The internet really didn't start until my late teens, maybe even early 20s. And folks that have grown up with the internet, which is most people listening here, have no idea what an absolute revolution the internet was. I mean, it was magic. For example, I'm a massive hockey fan. If I wanted to know if the Kings won or lost the night before, I had three choices. I could turn the TV news on and, first of all, hope the news was on at that time and wait for the sports to come on. Or I could listen to the radio, news radio, and wait for the sports to come on 20 and 50 past the hour. Or I could wait for the newspaper to arrive in the morning. A lot of people subscribe to the newspaper, would come every day. I know this seems very foreign to people who live with the internet, but it was just it was magic. It was just genuinely uncharted territory. Suddenly we could get information. It's not like the internet of today. We could get information on whatever websites happen to exist. Flash forward to the early 90s. I'm managing big rock band, and we want a website. We've heard about these things called websites, and we wanted a website for the band. Cool indie bands had websites. The Beastie Boys were one of the real early bands that had a super cool website. They had a record label called Grand Royal. But even in the early to mid 90s, most bands didn't have websites. And we thought it was a great way to, be in touch with the fans, et cetera, et cetera. So I got introduced to this guy called Chris. And Chris had made a bunch of websites for a bunch of bands, mostly indie bands. I wouldn't say a bunch, maybe 3 or 4. And to me, Chris was a wizard because Chris could make a website and suddenly get all this information in people's hands. And this was a big, big mystery. No one really understood how it works. This is prior to computer science being such a broad major and so broadly adapted and so many people doing software development. And he knew how to do it. And he'd made these sites for these indie bands. So we thought, let's have this guy in. Let's talk to him. So I had a couple of the band members, myself and my boss. We all gathered into a room. And Chris went over his vision of what he thought was possible for this website. And we were absolutely hooked. We thought, okay, this is stuff. And he was even talking about stuff that bands, the indie bands, didn't have the means to be able to do, meaning, people that could sort of change the stuff, change the content, whatever, which was a big deal back then. It's not like today where it was just instant. There wasn't things like WordPress. And so here we are, we're sitting with the wizard and he's telling us what we can do. And we were absolutely just, he had us in the palm of his hands. And then he comes to a point where he says, okay, yep, I can do it. And we were ready to go. And he said, it's going to be $40,000. Now, $40,000 at the time is probably about, $100,000 now. And we about fell out of our chairs. One of the band members for sure wanted to just literally beat his ass right there in the room. It was very insulting. The band had just started making money, even though they'd been popular for a couple of years. That's kind of how it works. And so they were very conscious. This was probably the peak of this consciousness of people trying to take them for a ride because the perception was they had millions and millions of dollars, which they didn't, because most bands don't until they have a multi-album, multi-tour career. Especially bands at the time, we could only charge $20 for a ticket. Nowadays, they charge $400 for the same ticket in the same venue, by the way. And so they just knew he was kind of punishing us because of his perception. And we also knew that the 4 bands that he'd done websites for probably didn't collectively make $40,000 a year in income. So we knew there's no way they were paying $40,000 to this guy. So I got a bit upset, and one of the band members particularly got upset. And basically we wound up throwing him out of the room. Now, I have to give Chris some credit because even though the number was crazy, his leverage was absolutely extreme. Like, he knew he was one of the few people that could do this, and he's one of the few people that had some relationships in the entertainment industry, and so he could kind of get access and sort of take advantage of that access and that leverage. Fair enough. Like, that's business. It's fine. So I give the guy some credit, but he was just so arrogant about it and just so absolutely haughty about the fact that this is what it costs. He kept saying, this is what it costs. We kept saying, guy, well, show us how this breaks down. Like, aren't you the only guy that does it? Yeah. Okay. How long will it take you? A month. Whoa, wait a minute. We're going to pay you $40K a month? Like, at the time that was the record company president was probably maybe making $40K a month. So crazy. Anyway, so we threw him out of the room, and then I just kept kind of calling him and saying, hey, look, we'd love to have you do this, but this is insane. Could we, is there some way we could reduce the costs? Is there someone junior, less experienced than you that you could have do some of the base work, whatever, this, that, and the other? He's like, nope. He always would say, this is what it costs. This is what it costs. No flexibility at all. So we eventually gave up and, let him go. We eventually found someone to build us a website. They did. It worked fine. And I believe it was $6,000, which, relative to what you can pay today, obviously was still kind of high, but really, really worth it. And it worked fine. And the guy was great. Then, I never thought about this guy again, but, a year passed, a couple years passed, and things like GeoCities arrived. No one will remember GeoCities on this, but GeoCities was the first technology that allowed a random person to build a website. Now, when we say website, the websites were extremely basic, but you could build your own website. For example, as simple as this may seem, if you were a plumber, you could say, my name is Joe, I'm a plumber, here's my phone number, call me. Put that on the internet. There was nothing like that, even that simple of a website. So these companies, these things like GeoCities had value. And so I never thought about this guy again. And, then it became very practical for people to have websites. But probably 2 years later, I am in Best Buy. And I look over, I wasn't even going to the tech thing. They had this little part, I think they still do in Best Buys, where you can go get your computer fixed and whatever and stuff like that. And what do you know? There was Chris. And being the petty human being that I can be, I was like, all right, let me go over and talk to this guy. Hey, Chris, how are you? Hey. Oh, yeah. And he recognized me immediately, and his eyes dropped to the floor. And I said, how's the web building business go? And I, just sort of to stick the needle in. And that probably pissed him off. And so he just defiantly said, you guys don't understand. It's so difficult and this and that. And you weren't hip to the technology. You didn't get it. Well, we didn't get it, but, we also didn't pay the thing. And he kept going and going. I was like, okay, name tag boy, just chill out. But he never backed down. And even though he was then going to go back to fixing someone's, Mac 2 or whatever, and it always stuck with me. It stuck with me, his lack of flexibility. And I think that's really the lesson here. It's like, Chris, he wasn't wrong about the technology at all. In fact, he was right about the technology, and he was right really early. But he was wrong about the window and how long he had. And certainly in the world of AI, the window changes hourly. I mean, it's way different than the early days of the internet. The window of what is possible and what is coming with AI is just so short these days. And like many people in AI today, Chris had a real edge. He really did. I mean, he was, like I said, it's hard to describe. It's hard to describe properly, but we really did think he was a wizard. But he had that edge, and he held onto it too tight, and the world changed, and he was left behind with his blue shirt at Best Buy. And I think that's, strong convictions loosely held is one of the real mantras in business. Have strong convictions, but hold them loosely, meaning if people can, change your mind, be open to people changing your mind and be open to being flexible. Honestly, if Chris came back and said 20, we probably would have done it because we did have money at the time. And he would have made $20,000 in a month, which at the time was a fortune. But he didn't. And I respect it on one level, but it's also just absolutely commercial suicide anyway. And I think that's another thing that really, really dawned on me then. The people that are most at risk in any big tech shifts aren't actually the ones that ignore it. They're the ones who learn one version and then stop there, or they're the ones who just make up their mind about something and won't change. And then inevitably, the technology changes, culture changes, whatever changes, and it just passes them by. The ones that ignore it, I'm a little bit like this at first with technologies. The ones that ignore it, everything gets productized. The thing that you need is now developed, as opposed to you having to develop or find someone to develop it. If you need someone to help promote your real estate business, there's AI for that, and it's sophisticated, and it's only going to get more sophisticated. So I think the thing that stuck with me was, hey, have some flexibility here. And I feel like, connecting this back to AI, I feel like we're at the moment, and I think about this a lot, we're at the moment right now, maybe just a couple months ago, we were at the moment with AI that Chris was with the internet. It's still very clunky in a lot of ways, but it's moving extremely fast. The people who knew the value of the internet all the way back then knew it for sure. And they were putting all their resources into them. And many are the titans of today, business-wise, Elon Musk and people like that, Mark Andreessen. So I think that it's a really interesting thing to think about where it's going, be flexible, trust your sources, find sources you trust. This is key because you're going to find 100. If you ask 100 people on the internet a question, you're going to get 100 different answers. But the experts don't know. The companies don't know. They think, they suspect, they make bets, but they don't know. And so the question isn't necessarily, will AI take my job? The question is, how fast can you move when the window shifts? If you want the deeper version of these ideas, I write a newsletter called Winning at Work. You can find it in the show notes.
Follow Winning at Work on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen, and find us at winningatwork.io and across all socials.